Happy Wednesday, Bio 47. We're continuing with our unit on the nervous system, and I'm going to talk through the Lab 23 materials and PowerPoint. And in lab, what we'll be focusing on is learning the anatomy of the brain and the spinal cord, as well as the cranial nerves. So today we'll be talking about the brain. So the central nervous system, as you know, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain is broken up into 5 regions in the adult brain. The telencephalon is the cerebrum, those 2 cerebral hemispheres in blue up there. The diencephalon, which is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, illustrated in orange. And you know about the hypothalamus because it controls the pituitary and thus a lot of the endocrine system. Then there's the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, which is in purple. The metencephalon, which is the pons and cerebellum, in green. And the myelencephalon, the medulla oblongata, which is in that sort of purplish pink there. And the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. There's no division between them. These words look a little foreign, a little bit confusing to remember. They all end with encephalon, meaning the brain or the head. And then the last 3, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon, they're in order from anterior to posterior, and they're in alphabetical order. So there's M-E-S, M-E-T, and M-Y, and that might help you remember them in order. The brain is organized into these regions because it's based on the hollow spaces that travel through the brain and the spinal cord. So the central nervous system starts developing about 3 to 4 weeks into development, and it starts as this hollow tube that's filled with fluid, known as the neural tube. And that's what's shown on the far left there. Along development, it starts to develop these 3 distinct swellings named for their positions. And that's part B, the primary brain vesicles, the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. And you don't need to remember those names. And then as the nervous system continues to develop, then those anterior and posterior swellings continue to specialize. And those original 3 swellings become the 5 main brain regions. And all of these brain regions surround a hollow space that's filled with fluid, and each of them has a specialized function. So the telencephalon is organized around these fluid-filled spaces called the lateral ventricles. The diencephalon is organized around the 3rd ventricle. The mesencephalon is organized around the cerebral aqueduct, which is a silly name because it's not in the cerebrum, right? It's not in the telencephalon, it's in the mesencephalon, the midbrain. Then the metencephalon is organized around the 4th ventricle, and the myelencephalon has the central canal that travels through it and continues into the spinal cord. And here's a look at these hollow spaces inside the brain. They're called ventricles, and cerebrospinal fluid is created in the ventricles and flows through the ventricles. I'm going to show an image that shows them a little bit better. So here's a lateral view and an anterior view of the brain showing the ventricles in blue. The lateral ventricles, there's 2 of them, and let me get my laser pointer. And the lateral ventricles are these really large C-shaped structures. So there's a C and with the horn on the back. So that whole thing, the C-shaped structure with the hole, is 1 lateral ventricle. And there's 1 on each side of the brain, 1 in each hemisphere of the cerebrum. So those are the lateral ventricles. And cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that fills and surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, is produced in those lateral ventricles. And it travels through the interventricular foramen, an open space in the brain, into the 3rd ventricle. There's just 1 3rd ventricle. And that's in the diencephalon. And cerebrospinal fluid drains from there down through the cerebral aqueduct. Remember, that's in the mesencephalon, and into the 4th ventricle, within the metencephalon and into the central canal, that hollow space in the center of the myelencephalon, and down into the spinal cord. So the brain is protected and supported by that cerebrospinal fluid. The brain is also protected and supported by this three-membrane layer that envelop the brain and the spinal cord. And these three layers are known as the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And on here, here's the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So the dura mater is shown here. It's called the tough mother. It's the outermost, and it's the thickest, the most protective, and within the cranium, it's mostly fused to the periosteum of the overlying bone. So it's really tightly knit in most places to the overlying bone. The subdural space is a hypothetical space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is said to be the spider-like mother, like, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. It's because it has this webbed appearance. And below the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space, and that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So in here, where this webbing is, that's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And the last membrane is the pia mater. The pia mater is the gentle mother. It really tightly adheres to the surface of the brain. The same way that the periosteum adheres to the surface of bone, you can't peel the pia mater away from the brain. So these three membranes protect and envelop the brain and the spinal cord. And here's another illustration showing those three membranes from a slightly different view. So out here would be the skin of the scalp, and then would be the bone of the skull. Then we would have the periosteum of the bone of the skull and the dura mater, illustrated in light blue here, and it should be really tightly attached to the periosteum of the overlying bone. Then deep to that is the arachnoid mater and the subarachnoid space in which cerebrospinal fluid is traveling. And deep to that, right on the surface of the brain, following its every ridge and fold, is the pia mater, that gentle mother. So I said that in most places, the dura mater is really attached to the periosteum of the overlying bone. And in some places, it's not attached, and it separates from the overlying bone and forms a tough downward fold. And these folds project into deep fissures in the brain, lending support to the brain. So this would be an example here in tan is the dura mater. And in this area, it's really closely attached to the overlying bone, but now it's forming this fold that's going between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. And so it's separating away from the bone, forming a dural fold. And in this case, it's forming a fold that's called the falx cerebri. So typically these folds are called the falx, and then they have a descriptive name. So this is a fold into the cerebrum. It's the falx cerebri. And when dura mater separates from the bone to form a dural fold, then there's some space that's left behind. So now there is an open space between the dura mater and the overlying bone. That space is called the dural sinus. That's the general term. This one specifically is the superior sagittal sinus, and that's running the length of the cerebrum along the sagittal plane between the two hemispheres. So when dura mater pulls away, it makes a fold called a falx, and the space that's left behind, that empty space, that's called a sinus, a dural sinus. So this is another view of the dural sinuses and the dural folds. There are 3 dural folds that you need to be able to name and 1 dural sinus that you need to be able to name. The 3 folds are the ones that I was just talking about, the falx cerebri, and here all of that neural tissue has been removed, and you can see just the dura mater folding down to make the falx cerebri along the sagittal plane, separating the two hemispheres of the brain. There's another one in the same plane, that's the falx cerebelli, and that's also along the sagittal plane, and it separates the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, which would sit right here over the occipital bone. And there's one more, and it's a little bit harder to envision. This is the tentorium cerebelli. It's forming sort of a tent above the cerebellum. It would be projecting out of the screen toward you and away from you. So it's perpendicular to the falx cerebri and the falx cerebelli. So those are the three folds that you need to know. The one dural sinus is this superior sagittal sinus, and it's illustrated in blue to show that it's carrying deoxygenated blood. So the dural sinus is where cerebrospinal fluid drains into. It contains deoxygenated blood that's returning to circulation. So the ventricles and the subarachnoid space contain cerebrospinal fluid. And once that cerebrospinal fluid gets used, that is, the oxygen gets taken up, the nutrients get taken up, then it drains back into the dural sinuses and back into the blood. So the one that you need to know is the superior sagittal sinus. And I'll go over a little bit more detail about cerebrospinal fluid and the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, it has three really important life-sustaining functions. So it keeps brain tissue buoyant, it's acting as a cushion or a shock absorber. So just like in a synovial joint, the bones are kept apart by fluid, the brain is kept separate from the bones of the cranium by the cerebrospinal fluid. It also acts as a vehicle for delivering nutrients to the brain and removing waste. And it can flow between the cranium and the spine to balance out the amount of volume that's inside of the brain. And eventually, the fluid is completely absorbed into the bloodstream as it circulates, but there are some circumstances that can interrupt its normal flow. If the balance is interrupted, then hydrocephaly can result, and that's when you can get a really swell head. You might have to get a hole drilled into the skull to drain some of the cerebrospinal fluid if the balance of this flow is off. So what are the steps? The first one is that the cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by the choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle. So this is the lateral ventricle right here, this light blue shape. And these things that look like wiggly red lines, that's meant to represent the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is an association of capillaries together with ependymal cells that are pulling out some of the components, but not all of the components of blood. So it's being produced from the blood in the lateral ventricle. And then that cerebrospinal fluid flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle in the diencephalon. And there's also choroid plexus in the third ventricle, adding more cerebrospinal fluid. Then it flows down the cerebral aqueduct, down into the fourth ventricle, this sort of triangular shape here, that's the fourth ventricle, which also has a choroid plexus. That adds in more cerebrospinal fluid. And it flows out from there, and it flows out to either circulate around the external surfaces of the brain in the subarachnoid space, and that's what's shown here, and it travels down the central canal, down into the spinal cord, and then it would come up on either side of the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord. And it flows up and around the surface of the brain in these subarachnoid spaces until it reaches this specialized structure, the arachnoid villi. And the arachnoid villi is where the arachnoid mater pokes through the dura mater and allows for cerebrospinal fluid to get reabsorbed into the venous blood. That means deoxygenated blood going back to the heart. And that's at the dural sinuses. So I also want to cover some gross anatomy of the brain, just being able to identify some of the lobes and some of the structures. So the cerebrum is divided up into lobes, and some of them are labeled here. So there's the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is everything that's anterior to the central sulcus. So all of this would be frontal lobe. Everything that's posterior is the parietal lobe, and back in this back region is the occipital lobe. This region over here, defined by the lateral sulcus, that's the temporal lobe, and all of that's the cerebrum. And then back here, you can see the cerebellum. You can see the pons, this big belly structure, and the medulla oblongata leading down into the spinal cord. From the superior view, you can see the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. You can see the frontal lobe, just marked by the central sulcus, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Can't really see the temporal lobe. And then traveling along the mid-sagittal line is the longitudinal or interhemispheric fissure. So I want to talk a little bit more about the lobes. So here's the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is going to be responsible for conscience, for judgment, for motivation. And the frontal lobe is everything that's in yellow here. So it's defined by the anterior border of the brain, by the central sulcus, which is the one line down the brain that's perpendicular to the longitudinal fissure, and it goes all the way from this transverse fissure all the way up to the longitudinal fissure. So that's what to look for to identify the central sulcus, one uninterrupted line traveling down the side of the cerebrum. Behind that is the parietal lobe. This is primarily a sensory and association area. Back here is the occipital lobe, which is the primary visual cortex responsible for vision. There's not really a good defining line to be able to identify the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe, which looks sort of like the thumb of the mitten here, marked by that lateral fissure there, is the temporal lobe. That's that primary auditory cortex. And then again, down here, you can see the cerebellum, and you can see the pons and the medulla oblongata. So here's another way to see it. In that frontal lobe, we have executive functions, thinking, planning, problem solving, behavioral control, personality. And this line right here, the division between the red and the orange, that would be the central sulcus, the line that's going all the way from that lateral fissure to the interhemispheric fissure. Just anterior to that is the primary motor cortex. This is responsible for all of your conscious movement, and that's part of the frontal lobe. Just posterior to the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex, or the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is going to be receiving all of your conscious sensations. And that's part of the parietal lobe. And then again, parietal lobe is perception, making sense of the world. Occipital lobe is going to be responsible for vision. Temporal lobe, some things related to memory, understanding, language, and hearing. And this is a fun thing that shows those primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex, and how much brain real estate is devoted to different parts of your body. So on the left here is the somatosensory cortex. And remember, that's just posterior to the central sulcus. It's in the parietal lobe. And the amount of surface area that's devoted to each portion of the body tells you about how much sensory input you get from that region of the body. So a huge portion of the somatosensory cortex receives sensation from structures related to the lips, the tongue, and the mouth. Then a lot of information as well from the hand and the fingers, letting you know that these areas have really high concentrations of receptors for touch. And then there's much, much less devoted to things like the leg, the foot, the shoulder, the arm. So if you were scaled according to your sensory arrangement, then you have a much, much larger face and mouth and hands relative to your body size. A lot of the same is true for this primary motor cortex. Remember, that's anterior to the central sulcus. It's in the frontal lobe, and this is showing how much nerve power is devoted to movements of each one of these body parts. So you have a lot of nerves that are responsible for moving the eyes, lips, jaw, tongue. A lot of things are responsible for moving the face and for these very dexterous, quick, skilled movements of the hands, and much less so for movements of the trunk, hip, knee, etc. So these areas, the face and the hand, these are going to have much smaller motor units and more, comparatively speaking, neurons controlling them. And these other areas of the body would have much larger motor units, relatively fewer neurons controlling them. In the ventral view of the brain, what we're looking at is the anterior is at the top of the screen, and the posterior is at the bottom of the screen. You can see the ventral or inferior view of the frontal lobe. You can see this thumb part here, and this is the temporal lobe. We can't really see the other lobes, maybe just a little bit of the occipital lobe right here. So you can see some of the different lobes of the cerebrum. Other features that you can see on the inferior side of the cerebrum, you can see these two structures sticking out. Those two are the olfactory bulbs and olfactory tracts. The olfactory bulb right here sits on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Hopefully you remember that the cribriform plate has the olfactory foramina. So these olfactory bulbs are responsible for transmitting odors to the cortex. We keep moving posteriorly. We get to this region right here. And this region is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon has this distinct X structure right here. So X, X, and this is going to be responsible for the sense of vision. So the top legs of the X are the optic nerves. So they're reaching out to the back of the eyeballs. Then the spot where they cross over, where they make the spot where the X crosses over, that's the optic chiasm. Chiasm means crossing over. And then the back lower legs of the X, those are the optic tracts. Not labeled right here, there's a little piece that sticks out, and this would be the infundibular stalk. That's where the pituitary hangs from. So we're now above the sphenoid bone. In the posterior most part of the diencephalon are the mammillary bodies right here. The mammillary bodies are part of the limbic system, responsible for memories. They look sort of like a pair of breasts, so you can remember that that sort of sounds like mammary. It's mammillary bodies. And then you can see just a section here of the midbrain, the mesencephalon. So it's just this which the laser pointer is on right now. It's involved in motor control, in regulation of the sleep-wake cycle, in temperature regulation. Then we move back into the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, and that's the pons, this big swollen area right here. Everything that I'm tracing with the laser pointer is the pons, and the pons is essentially a relay station. It's connecting the diencephalon to the medulla and to the cerebellum. So it's a waypoint for nerves. The other part of the metencephalon is the cerebellum, which is the little beautiful brain. It's got two hemispheres and a wrinkly surface, and it has several functions relating to movement and to coordination, including maintaining balance. The last section, the myelencephalon, is the medulla oblongata. It's responsible for autonomic or unconscious functions like vomiting, sneezing, breathing, heart rate. So a general theme that you've probably noticed is going from really complex, evolved functions like motivation and speech in the cerebrum, and then getting into the more reptilian brain, leading down into the brainstem and into the spinal cord. So things that are more related to involuntary responses and keeping you alive, those are getting more down into the brainstem and the spinal cord. And you'll notice that the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. It's just considered the spinal cord once it leaves the bones of the cranium. The last thing that we're going to see on the ventral surface of the brain, at least for today, is this famous cerebral circle, or the circle of Willis. And this is a joining area where there are several arteries on the inferior side of the brain. And what this does is provide blood flow to the brain, as well as provide these alternative pathways for oxygen to be able to supply the brain. So the central nervous system is really important, and it needs specialized structures to make sure that circulation is maintained. And this starts with this really unique arrangement of blood vessels that carry fresh blood into the central nervous system. You all know that after that blood gets supplied, the central nervous system filters that blood and makes cerebrospinal fluid. That cerebrospinal fluid is circulated through the cavities of the brain and the spinal cord, called the ventricles, and through the subarachnoid space. And then once it passes through the central nervous system, it returns to the circulation through the dural sinuses and into veins and back into circulation. And there are some of these arteries that are serving the underside of the brain that we do need to know. So there's blood flow into the brain from 4 paired arteries. Those 4 paired arteries are this segment right here, and this segment right here. And those are the internal carotid arteries. These are arteries that travel up the neck and into the base of the brain. If you ever feel your pulse on the side of your neck, what you're feeling is the pulse of the carotid arteries. And that's blood that's headed up to serve the head and the brain. So blood is coming in, one-way flow in through the carotid arteries. Blood also comes in through the 2 vertebral arteries. So this one right here is a vertebral artery, and this one right here is a vertebral artery. So blood is coming into this circuit through the internal carotid arteries, 2 of them, 1 on each side, and the vertebral arteries, 1 on each side. The vertebral arteries fuse, so it's sort of like the legs go up and make the torso, and the torso is the basilar artery. So the vertebral arteries fuse and make the basilar artery. From there, blood flows out to the brain through 3 pairs of arteries. The first one is the anterior cerebral arteries, and it's this sort of L shape right here. So this section right here is all anterior cerebral arteries. So that's one. Now on the other side, this is another anterior cerebral artery. And this has one-way flow of blood. It's headed out toward the anterior brain. And on the other side, headed out toward the anterior brain. The next are the middle cerebral, and blood is flowing out toward the middle of the brain through one side and out to serve the other side of the brain on the other side, and then out to the posterior brain through the posterior cerebral, and on the other side, posterior cerebral. So that's serving all of the regions of the brain. But if there was a clot anywhere in this system that stopped blood flow to any region of the brain, it would be super dangerous. So there's redundancy in the system that lets the blood reroute in case of a blockage. And there are three that you need to know. One is just this tiny piece up here where the laser pointer is right now. That's the anterior communicating arteries, and that connects the two anterior cerebral arteries. So just this little stretch right here is the anterior communicating artery. Then there are two posterior communicating arteries. So this is one connecting the internal carotid to the posterior cerebral, and over here, another posterior communicating artery. And these communicating arteries, unlike the cerebral arteries, they allow two-way flow of blood in the communicating arteries. All of the other arteries, the anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries, the vertebral arteries, the basilar artery, and the internal carotid artery, all of those are just one-way flow into the brain from the body or out to different portions of the brain. So this is something that it's worth practicing with. You'll want to be able to identify anterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, internal carotid arteries, middle cerebral arteries, posterior communicating arteries, posterior cerebral arteries, the basilar artery, and the vertebral artery. Everything else that's labeled on here is more detail than you need to know. So I'm going to leave it there for lab 23. Make sure that you read over the lab, review some of those diagrams, and complete the module that I've posted with some online quizzes that will help you practice with some of this material.